Thank you for coming out tonight to the 9th Annual University of Montana Alumni Association Community Lecture Series. This is our 9th year, and I'm real excited, and I appreciate your turnout. Let me ask you right now to put your cell phones on vibrate. Thank you. Or off, whichever you prefer. My title on campus is the On-Campus Events Coordinator, and I want to take just a second to plug Charter Day, which takes place Thursday. Charter Day is the university's birthday. UM is 114 years old this year. There's a ceremony at 5:30 just on the other side of us in the ballroom, and we'll recognize some recipients of awards. It'll be great fun, and we have a reception afterwards, and if you can join us, we'd sure love to have you. My name is Ken Thompson. I work with some really fine community folks for this lecture series every year. I work with Ann Boone, Don Hobby, and Kitty Robbins, along with some campus folks. And they work really hard to bring a classroom experience to Missoula folks who don't get that opportunity. Also, we have our other lecturers in the audience tonight for the rest of the series, and we're real glad to have them, and it's going to be a really interesting and I think stimulating series. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Linda Jillison. Linda was born at a very early age in Kentucky. And she received her BA in Latin from the University of Louisville, and then her PhD in Classics from the University of Minnesota. She taught at the University of Washington in Seattle and Northwestern University. Linda's been at UM since 1992. And during her time at UM, she's worked in the Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures Department, and also Liberal Studies, the English Department, and the Davidson Honors College. She's a fellow, which means she won the Rome Prize in Classics, of the American Academy in Rome. She's on sabbatical next year, researching Cicero's ethical treatise called On Duties, which sounds really interesting. And a unique fact about Linda, she enjoys taking students underground when she's in Rome with them to see the burial place of St. Peter. And is he really buried there? Who knows? At this time, Linda Jillison, thank you.
I'll just have to pump for my next Rome trip, and so we can all come and look at St. Peter. Is he or isn't he? Thanks a million, Ken. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to be able to serve as the moderator for this series this year. I was involved as one of the lecturers a few years ago and had a wonderful, wonderful time working with Herb Swick and some of my colleagues with whom I don't get a lot of chance to work because we're not in the same department. This year we're doing something a little bit different. I'm going to see if I can get this down a little. Thank you. You know, I suppose, that the title of this year's series is Ways of Knowing. And that's actually a title which is shared by a course which has been taught for several years and now to Honors College freshmen. It's one of the required courses in the Honors College curriculum at the Davidson Honors College. Since some of the really outstanding faculty members, very thoughtful, very competent, very much involved with students who are on this campus, really do participate as part of the teaching faculty in this particular course, which is a multi-section course, several different faculty members teaching their own classes. And since this is exactly the kind of person whom I know a lot of you come to see and to listen to and to interact with at this kind of an event and in this kind of series, the Alumni Association thought it might be a good idea if we exposed you to some of the content of this course, the Ways of Knowing, and also some of the faculty members who teach Honors College freshmen in this particular course every semester. And those are the people who are going to be participating in our series. Now, to give you some idea about the nature of this course, and I promise we won't do this many introductions the next time, but in order to give you some idea about the nature of this course, I'd like to present to you Dean James McCusick, who is the Dean of the Davidson Honors College and also a professor of English here on campus. Dean McCusick earned his doctorate at Yale, where his research and teaching interests included Romanticism of the British world, literary theory, environmental studies, and the history of science. So we might think of him as sort of a Renaissance man and exactly the kind of person who is really excellent for us in the Davidson Honors College. He's very widely published, and most recently you may have read about him in the Missoulian, my source. He's very widely published, and when you saw him in the Missoulian, it was because he is, as Jim said to me, in his usual modest way, enjoying his 15 minutes of fame now. He made headlines for his groundbreaking work on a translation of Goethe's Faustus, one of the most important plays, literary works of Western literature, into English, a work which he and his collaborator were able to identify as the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, one of the British Romantic poets, through a statistical analysis called stylometrics. Now, when we all got together to talk about the series, one of the lecturers, and I believe he's here tonight, said, you know, it's always fun to have some unique wacko fact to tell about each person. So I said, not too wacko, just let's keep it within bounds. But I ask everyone, and Jim is probably going to think that the wacko fact I'm going to talk about is that he understands what stylometrics is, which is, to me, kind of bizarre. But no, that's not what he thought was bizarre. And what he thought was interesting is something I found out about a lot of people who come to this university. That is that Jim first traveled in Montana when he was 10 years old with his family. He traveled in Yellowstone. He was absolutely smitten by the country and the land and the geysers and the animals. He came then later on to be an intern at the Kicking Horse Job Corps up in Ronan. Some of you will know where that is. Again, loved being in the Mission Mountains and said to himself, I think I'm going to be back here one day. Well, he's a very smart man, and he's a very wise man, and he's back. So I want to introduce to you now, and thank you for being here with us, Dean James McCusick of the Davidson Honors College.
Well, thank you, Linda, and I'm truly honored to be in front of such an august audience. One of the great things about the University of Montana is the commitment of its alumni and also of the strong support we receive from community members. So thank you all for being here, and I think you're in store for a wonderful series of lectures. The Davidson Honors College, as you probably know, is a highly selective program at the University of Montana for talented and highly motivated undergraduates. They complete a rigorous curriculum of honors courses across the broad spectrum of the liberal arts and sciences, and at the very core of that curriculum is the Ways of Knowing course. And you are going to receive over the next few weeks an unadulterated series of lectures straight from the heart of that course by the very core of the faculty who teach it. And without going into too much detail, I want to capture for you the concept, the underlying notion of the Ways of Knowing course, which is somewhat unique among national core curricula in honors colleges. I can tell you that it is uncharacteristic because of its underlying model of inquiry. And if I could summarize it in a sentence, I would borrow from Hamlet's little remark to his friend Horatio. Hamlet said, "There is more in heaven and earth than is dreamt of in your philosophy." And that pretty much sums it up. The point of Ways of Knowing is not to pack the students' heads with more facts, because we believe that facts do not sum up to knowledge. Knowledge instead, especially in today's very dynamic world where knowledge essentially facts go out of date in 5 years. Knowledge is constituted not so much by a big pile of facts, but more by an inquiring, curious sensibility, a sensibility that's willing to think outside the box, to use a terrible cliche, or to imagine things that are not yet known to exist. We also take seriously the the uncertainty principle, the notion that a thing observed is changed by the presence of the observer, and indeed even by the mere fact of observation. Just looking at something changes it. So things don't stand still in ways of knowing. They move around. And the knowledge that students come into the course thinking that they know may well be undermined or at least scrutinized and skeptically examined by the time they leave the course. And I hope, although you may be at a different point in your life journey from those 17 and 18-year-old freshmen that we teach Ways of Knowing to, you may still benefit from the same mode of skeptical inquiry. Skeptical not in that corrosive or Humean sense, but rather in that generative sense that Socrates first introduced skeptical inquiry into the Western philosophical tradition. And to end up with one more quote, which is just 2 words, I think Socrates summed it up best when he said, "Genothi se auton," which means know yourself. Know your very own true inner self. And with that knowledge, you can go forth and conquer worlds unknown. With that, I turn it back to my friend Linda.
I know that some of you have participated in these series before, and it really will be a participatory matter, we hope, because the format of each one of these evenings will be a set of remarks for maybe 45 minutes or so from each of the lecturers, and then plenty of time for interaction between you, the students, and the faculty member who has given the lecture. Remember that the very last evening there's going to be a panel discussion. All of the lecturers will be here for the panel discussion, and they will certainly want to interact with you at that time also. We will be finished by 9 o'clock, so don't ding the bell or anything, but we'll finish by that time. And now for the heart of the evening, to which the rest of us are really mere preparation. I want to introduce to you next Gary Hawk, who is our lecturer for this evening. Gary earned his BA in English from Stanford University and then his Master of Divinity degree from the Pacific School of Religion. For several years after that, he served as pastor in various kinds of communities, some of them rural communities in Northern California, and then finally he moved out to Helena, Montana. I have to say I don't know exactly the process that brought him to us in Missoula, but I'm very, very happy that it did. Gary's been on the teaching faculty at the Davidson Honors College for several to, I would say, almost many years now. And about 2 years ago, he joined the faculty of Ways of Knowing, being exactly the kind of thinking, questioning, feeling person who is exactly right for this kind of course. And I think that his students have loved him. His responses are always good from students and from colleagues, and that's why he's here with you today. The unique fact about him is that he has a red and yellow sea kayak, which he has not donated to KUFM as a premium yet, but maybe later on in the week, named Kestrel. Maybe he'll take us all for a float. I don't know. In any case, I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce to you today Gary Hawk, whose presentation is entitled Starlight on Stone, Suffering and Its Transcendence in the Book of Job. Gary.
To whoever is in the booth, I think I'm going to set this mic aside because it seems to interfere with my relationship with the people who are here. And I will both speak up and use the small microphone. Linda, thank you for your introduction. Jim, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to teach in the Davidson Honors College and in the Ways of Knowing program in particular. And I want to thank the UM Alumni Association for inviting me to speak in this series. My Ways of Knowing colleagues and I did not exactly pull straws when it came to choosing who would address which topic. But I'm willing to bet that they are probably relieved that I ended up with the book of Job. I can think of easier and certainly more cheerful places to start. Frankly, at this moment, I would rather be at the lecture on biomimicry rather than here, but if you don't leave, I won't leave. And by the way, after tonight, the lectures will probably contain more humor than I can fashion for this one, since after all, this talk is about suffering. Before we get to the book of Job, I need to establish a point of view. So I'm going to begin this lecture with a confession that might open me to ridicule in the academic world. Are you ready? I am a man of faith. By this I mean that I am not simply a former clergyman well past the last year of his leave of absence from parish ministry. I mean to make a distinction here between belief and faith, because faith is concerned about matters larger than doctrine. When I say that I am a man of faith, I mean that despite everything, I am still in conversation with something ultimate. By this confession, I mean that I am and remain, in Mary Oliver's terms, a bride married to amazement. Or to be more faithful to my own gender, I am a husband in love with mystery. I am a disciple on the shores of a singing sea. I am striving for what Simone Weil called intelligence illuminated by love. I am a student of what Rudolf Otto called the mysterium tremendum fascinans. By man of faith, I mean that I am committed to paying attention to the river of light that rolls through the universe. In this very large sense, I am a man of faith. What does being a person of faith look like? It looks something like this. And here I have a cartoon from Peanuts. Being a person of faith means going out in the dark and standing on a hillside alone or with someone else, looking up at the sky and being curious about a spot of light. Is that an airplane up there, Charlie Brown, or is it a star? It means replying to that question with an appropriate sense of the range of possibilities. I think maybe it is a star. Of course, it could be a planet or maybe even a Sputnik, meaning that it could be several things and that our knowledge of this light is incomplete. Being a person of faith means going beyond standing around wondering. It means walking away from the crowd, stepping apart, going someplace, and trying over and over to get a closer look, foolish as that seems. It means walking toward what is beautiful, and it means walking toward what is terrifying, knowing that both beauty and terror hold something worth consideration. Thank you for the cartoon. What does being a person of faith sound like? It sounds like this poem by W.S. Merwin. Listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. We are stopping on the bridge to bow from the railings. We are running out of the glass rooms with our mouths full of food to look at the sky and say thank you. We are standing by the water looking out in different directions, back from a series of hospitals, back from a mugging, after funerals. We are saying thank you. After the news of the dead, whether or not we knew them, we are saying thank you. In a culture up to its chin in shame, living in the stench of it, we are saying thank you. Over telephones, we are saying thank you in doorways and in the backs of cars and in elevators, remembering wars and the police at the back door. And the beatings on stairs, we are saying thank you. In the banks that use us, we are saying thank you. With the crooks in office, with the rich and fashionable unchanged, we go on saying, thank you, thank you. With the animals dying around us, our lost feelings, we are saying thank you. With the forests falling faster and faster than the minutes of our lives, we are saying thank you. With the words going out like cells of a brain, With the cities growing over us like the earth, we are saying thank you faster and faster with nobody listening. We are saying thank you. We are saying thank you and waving, dark though it is. Being a person of faith means working my way through pain felt at the condition of the world and finding a way to say thank you to someone or something, even if nobody is listening. It means pressing through the grief of this life toward the depths where we can be grateful to someone for something. It means pointing out a spot of light, dark though the times are. Now that I have this confession out of the way, let's go to work. This is going to be a fast ride over rough ground on an uncertain horse, so hang on. Those of us who teach in Ways of Knowing in the Davidson Honors College have been using the book of Job as a key text in the curriculum. While any of my colleagues might have been tapped to speak about this book, the assignment or the opportunity, depending on your point of view, fell to me. And I have not resisted it. In the classroom, we approach this book as literature, which I think is appropriate. But it is important to remember, however, that the book is written from inside the house of faith. Faith in the large sense that I am using the word. So here I am, a man of faith, speaking about a book that faces squarely the largest questions of faith. With these important preliminaries out of the way, I want now to summarize the book. Then I will draw out the implications and hopefully help us see the enormous contribution that Job continues to make to our understanding of how to live in this world. The structure of the book is important. As you may remember, it begins and ends with prose sections that tell the story or legend of a man named Job. In between these bookends, we find some of the most magnificent poetry in the whole Hebrew Bible. By means of its vivid imagery and parallel constructions, this poetry rivals that of the great prophet Isaiah. As the book opens, God and the accuser are about to make a bet with each other. The accuser contends that Job has been faithful merely because he has been untested. His life has been hedged about, and if more fully exposed to suffering, Job might not seem so faithful. In fact, as the accuser proposes, if Job were more exposed to suffering, he might sing a very different tune. In essence, Job has managed to avoid evil in his life rather than engage it and emerge from that engagement the same devoted soul. Accepting the bet, which is a terrifying thing to consider, God allows the accuser to destroy Job's flocks of sheep and those who tend them. God allows the accuser to strip Job of the currency of camels. And then God allows the accuser to rob Job of his children. As if this were not enough, Job finally loses his health and is forced to sit on the ground, scratching his boils and sores. In the process, he gets no sympathy from his ever-practical wife, who, tired of his husband's complaints, wishes that Job would curse God and die. When Job first speaks in response to this collapse of personal and familial fortune, he does not curse God exactly, but rather the day he was born. Stephen Mitchell, our translator, gets the tone exactly right when he puts in Job's mouth these opening words: "God damn the day I was born, and the night that forced me from the womb." To the Hebrew mind, this kind of cursing is a perfectly understandable and appropriate way of staying in faithful conversation with the divine. Cursing God may be one of the highest forms of intimacy. At this point in the drama, Job's so-called friends, who have been silently and patiently sitting with Job, can't stand to contain themselves a moment longer. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, taking turns through 3 long rounds, rush into the sweat house of Job's suffering with explanations for it, naively assuming that explanations will somehow lessen it. Being the first to speak, Eliphaz summarizes many of the explanations that follow. He says, in effect, Job, it is simply your turn to suffer. Misfortune rotates like a great wheel through our lives, crushing one person on Monday and another on Tuesday. Ultimately, no person is righteous before God, so quit defending your innocence. It is inevitable that we mortal beings suffer. This is simply our condition. If only you would pray about this, you might find your consolations, or at least quit bothering us with protests about your innocence. In truth, Job, Eliphaz is saying, you are lucky to be scolded by God because you might learn something in the process. And finally, God will rescue you and restore you if only you turn back in humility toward the cause of your weal and woe. Bildad and Zophar then take their turns trying to talk Job out of his feelings, adding to rather than mitigating his suffering. Like jazz musicians, they improvise variations on the theme. Bildad is especially harsh as he reinforces the old argument that suffering and punishment are joined in an eternal and immutable equation in which misery is proof of just deserts and good fortune a sign of God's approval. How long will you go on ranting, filling our ears with trash? Your children must have been evil. He punished them for their crimes. Imagine hearing that as a parent. And Zophar, hammering away on the same hot anvil, allows for the fact that Job may not be able to see the guilt that explains his suffering, but he is guilty nonetheless. Hear the sarcasm and the contempt in this. Should this man be saved by his words, acquitted because he speaks well? Should you mouth us into submission and go on with your impudent lies? You say, my conscience is clear. You think that your life is spotless. But if God were to cross-examine you and turned up your hidden motives and presented his case against you and told you why he had punished you, you would know that your guilt is great. And then, as if feeling a little guilty for speaking to his friend in this manner, Zophar plays the classic theme of restoration and says, come now, repent of your sins, open your heart to God, wash your hands of their wickedness, banish crime from your door. Then your soul will be pure. Your heart will be firm and fearless. All your suffering will vanish, flowing away like a stream. Your life will shine like the sun. Your darkest day will be bright. But the wicked will be punished. They will live in constant terror. Their hope will become a noose. In these and other passages, the so-called friends, however persuasive their speech, stand in for the accuser, and they actually compound Job's suffering. After each speech, Job responds with arguments of his own. But even more important than grasping the lines of Job's counter-argument is getting a sense of the inherent drama. When Job responds, more often than not, it is as though he is talking to himself or to God, rendering almost invisible or irrelevant the friends who are forever pointing their crooked fingers at a suffering man. For example, after Eliphaz distills the argument that pretends to explain suffering, Job responds not to Eliphaz, but to the universe. If only my prayer were answered and God granted my wish. If only he made an end of me, snipping my life like a thread. That is my only comfort as I writhe in this savage pain. How long can I keep on waiting? Why should I stay alive? Is my body hard as a rock? Is my flesh made of brass? All my strength has left me. All hope has driven away. This speech and many like it that follow capture perfectly the inevitable descent into narcissism that is a natural, I emphasize, natural part of suffering. Job's language, for all its intensity, is full of first-person pronouns. He is always saying me, my, and I. This is the rhetoric, the understandable rhetoric of narcissism. The dashing of our fortunes, the collapse of structures of meaning, the loss of everything we value, inevitably lead us to feel as though we have been watched, tracked, targeted, singled out, caught under the pressing thumb of the universe, and that we alone feel the pressure that threatens to squeeze the juice out of us. Job feels like a city besieged by an army. He feels like an ant under the focused light of a schoolboy's magnifying glass. In all his responses to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, it is as though Job surfaces and then disappears. He rises up out of his suffering to reply to his friends who are full of answers but devoid of compassion, and then he drops back down into the natural self-centeredness that accompanies any form of intense suffering. In this process, Job speaks for all who have ever suffered, and that is one of the reasons why Job and this book are so important. In this eternal and universal conversation, Job keeps trying to goad God into responding. He taunts God into testifying. And he occasionally reverses the grand courtroom metaphor so that Job becomes the prosecuting attorney and God a hapless witness on the stand. This is what makes Job a faithful man. He keeps speaking to God even though God seems to have turned away from him or turned a deaf ear. Job will take a cruel God or an indifferent God over no God at all. It is not too much to say that God is about the only thing that Job does not lose, no matter how absent or inscrutable this God seems. No matter how great his pain, Job keeps God on the ropes, locks God in the dock. I cry out, and you do not answer. I am silent, and you do not care. You look down at me with hatred and lash me with all your might. You toss me around in storm clouds, straddle me on the wind, and I know that you will destroy me and lock me in the house of the dead. Oh, if only God would hear me, state his case against me. Let me read his indictment. I would carry it on my shoulder or wear it on my head like a crown. I would justify the least of my actions. I would stand before him like a prince. Do you hear this? Job is not cowed by his suffering or by God. He remains faithful in his defiance, perversely obdurate through the 3 rounds of argument and counter-argument. What happens next is a reminder that we had better be careful what we ask for. Because after Job stands before God like a prince, God comes back at Job in the voice out of the whirlwind. In chapters 38 through 42, God says in effect, "Who the hell do you think you are? Who do you think you are in the context of my cosmic concern?" Let me give you a flavor of this magnificent language. Where were you when I planned the earth? Tell me if you are so wise. Do you know who took its dimensions, measuring its length with a cord? What were its pillars built on? Who laid down its cornerstone while the morning stars burst out singing and the angels shouted for joy? Have you ever commanded morning or guided dawn to its place, to hold the corners of the sky and shake off the last few stars? All things are touched with color. The whole world is changed. Have you seen to the edge of the universe? Speak up if you have such knowledge. This imagery of cosmic concern piles up like waves that crash on Job's boil-pocked head. As this happens, we must hear how God reverses the pronouns from the first to the second person, as if to say, I refuse to fall into the hole of defending myself to you. More is going on here than your suffering and the way it absorbs you. You can no longer be the focal point of the world. In stanza after stanza, we are taken through the world, from the constellations in the night sky to the depths of the sea, from the storm clouds in the air to the mud on the ground, from the wild lion on the prowl to the ox stumbling exhausted into the stable at the end of the day. Job and readers who identify with him are brought face to face with the war horse snorting with eagerness for battle, the hippo lying under the lotus, and the crocodile whose armor cannot be pierced. It is as though Job is presented with everything that is larger than himself. It simply does not matter that we modern or postmodern people might have explanations for the weather, that we might have scientific answers to God's rhetorical questions. What matters is that before the whirlwind, Job is thrown off center, tossed out of himself, helped to transcend the altogether too narrow focus of what has happened to him or been done to him. Furthermore, it is crucial for us to see in this crashing wave of poetry that we do not need to leave the world in order to transcend the suffering that afflicts us in the world. We do not need metaphysics that remove us from the world to help us deal with the physics in the world. In the end, as Stephen Mitchell makes clear, Job does not so much submit as surrender. He is not so much browbeaten as awakened. This distinction between submission and surrender is extremely important. Job surrenders to a greater mystery than he has heretofore comprehended. He surrenders to awareness that makes his prior wisdom seem like ignorance. He surrenders to an experience of God, not just knowledge about God. He surrenders in the way that the mystic surrenders. This is a kind of surrender that the average theologian and his systems cannot fathom. In the end, Job surrenders even to his mortality. I had heard of you with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I will be quiet, comforted that I am dust. With reference to this final form of surrender and with acute awareness of the problems of translation, Mitchell says, Job's comfort at the end is in his mortality. The physical body is acknowledged as dust, the personal drama as delusion. It is as if the world we perceive through our senses, that whole gorgeous and terrible pageant, were the breath-thin surface of a bubble, and everything else inside and outside is pure radiance. Both suffering and joy come then like a brief reflection on the surface of the bubble, and death like a pin. He feels he has woken up from a dream. That sense of actually seeing the beloved reality he has only heard of before is what makes his emotion at the end so convincing. He has let go of everything and surrendered into the light. In comparison with all that we have been through, what follows in the final prose section seems secondary. Again, overthrowing the old equation that says that those who are guilty deserve to suffer, God grants mercy to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who have spoken out of ignorance rather than true knowledge. Job gets back more sheep and camels than he had in the beginning. His children are restored to life. And all of his sorrow and suffering are swallowed up in peace, prosperity, and beauty, symbolized by his daughter's blue eyeshadow. Now that's the book in a nutshell. Now what can this book possibly mean for us, this anonymous, hard-to-date, poetic tour de force? The book of Job is about one man who suffers and the insight that comes to him in the process. In a sense, however, Job is not the exception. He is every man, every woman. His particular suffering represents one form of human suffering that takes lots of forms. As we know perfectly well, suffering can take a personal form. In conversation with a beloved partner or in a parent-child relationship, it sometimes seems as though every word you speak comes back to you in the cacophony of misunderstanding. Sometimes in our intimate relations, it feels as though every bit of light that flows out of us lands on a fractured mirror, and it comes back distorted, broken, unrecognizable, and we do not feel ourselves to be the person we know we are. A drunk driver kills your daughter or your husband and puts a cleft between the life you envisioned and the life you are going to lead. A friend is diagnosed with cancer, and the disease exposes every fault line in every relationship, tests every assumption we have ever made, sweeps us up into a system and treatment modalities that can actually be far worse than the disease itself, partly because of the denial mechanisms of those who fear death and then set these mechanisms in place. Or a man falls from a horse while on a pack trip in the Beartooths. He strikes his head against a stone and dies, leaving children without their father. A gifted young friend develops a thought disorder, and a once beautifully energetic mind turns chaotic, and the orderly thread that normally runs through a life ravels. Or a son kills himself when despair ambushes him. For him there seems no way out of the dark alley except the one offered by death. Or 6 young children die in an apartment house fire started by a candle. Or Amish schoolgirls are shot to death by the milkman. Personal forms of suffering, whether physical or relational, may also have an existential dimension. And here I am thinking about some of the very big questions that Jim referred to. In one of the editions of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, another key text in Ways of Knowing, Philip Appelman quotes Bertrand Russell in the introduction and puts this problem about as well as it can be put. That we are the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that our origin, our growth, our hopes and fears, our loves and our beliefs are but the accidental collocation of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of our achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins, All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. There are days when our lives and our prospects feel this bleak. Struggling with these questions can feel like a kind of suffering. If there are personal forms of suffering, relational, physical, and existential, there are also collective forms of suffering that our age and its media make excruciatingly clear. A jet aircraft loaded with fuel and passengers slams into a building as the mail carrier inside the tower sorts the mail. As the CEO revises his strategic plan, as the bond trader types in his deal, as the wife calls home to assure her husband and children that she will be all right. People in Iraq get rounded up by a militia. They are taken to secret rooms where their hands and feet are crushed, their knees drilled out with electric drills, and their amber skin is burned with various forms of fire. An Inupiat hunter goes out on ice warmed by atmospheric carbon. He falls through the once solid plates that have held up his people for millennia. Stuck in the slush for 2 days before being found and rescued, he returns home to a double amputation and the loss of his way of life. He is one among the countless who are already affected by global climate change. You get the point. I don't need to go on. All these forms of suffering have something in common. Suffering, individual or collective, physical or existential, upsets the narrative trajectory of our lives. Once this imagined narrative is upset, we begin to search our souls. In an effort to make sense of what is happening, we begin to ask questions. Questions like, what did I do to deserve this? What if I had done things differently? Would the hammer of fate have fallen somewhere else? Can I find somebody else to blame? Is my victimization evidence not of my wrongdoing, but rather proof of my virtue, evil always aiming its arrows at the innocent? If you are a fan of Farmer's Market, you may appreciate how Harvey Hedrick, masterful melon grower near Plains, Montana, poses the problem. Thinking of one of his worst days as a farmer, he says, after it hails 3 times on the same day, you begin to wonder if God still loves you. And when we suffer, we are in the midst of the inevitable questions that follow. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar magically show up on such days. They rush in with their answers to our questions, with answers that are not really addressed to our actual experience, but rather to their terror. They say the same things that clamored in the ears of Job. Well, pray about it, and then things will make sense. Your brother had a troubled life. Be glad it is over. Short as it may have been, maybe her life was nevertheless still somehow complete. You did everything you could. He is in a better place. She'll finally reap the rewards of a virtuous life. Even though we know better, you and I are sometimes in the role of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We say these things in order to try to make the unbearable bearable. We say these things hoping to reconstruct somebody else's narrative line. We say these things in order to try to contain the chaos that threatens to overwhelm us. We say these things trying to prop up the old and nearly worthless equation that asserts that the good will be rewarded and the bad will be punished. However well-intended, these answers are about as valuable as a wall of words erected against a hurricane. In other words, not much compared to the conclusion that Job comes to as the whirlwind around him suddenly grows quiet. In trying to understand such things, sometimes it helps to look just to the side, as when trying to see a faint star with our center-blind eyes. Consider Emily Dickinson, for example. Writing about these very issues, George Witcher says in his biography of Dickinson, Emily Dickinson was not, like Herman Melville, overwhelmed with a sense of the world's blind malice, nor had she the opportunity to acquire as extensive a collection of life's little ironies as Thomas Hardy possessed. But no sheltering hedges could protect her from pain and disillusionment and loss. She knew enough of God's ways toward human beings to be keenly aware of what she called the underside of His divinity. She had learned early that a human soul in search of either certainty or happiness found itself dealing with a thrifty deity. It was full of defects that she felt obliged to report to the management. Why were the fairest promises so seldom fulfilled, and golden opportunities so often hidden? Why was the victory postponed until it had lost its relish, and bliss hung within sight but out of reach? Why was knowledge of what we long to know obscured in shadow, but misery enlightened with a flood of daylight? Why was honey never steadfast, peace never assured? Her imagination supplied appropriate images to embody the satires of circumstance, the shipwreck, for saved 40 gone down together into the boiling sand. 2 swimmers wrestling for the spar that can uphold but one. Grand old Moses permitted to see the promised land, but barred by God from entering it. Listen as she might, the murmur of earth's perished patterns drowned out the alleged harmony of the spheres. Experience, it seemed, had only quandaries to offer. Here is the essence of the problem. If 2 swimmers wrestle for a single spar, if 4 out of 44 are saved on the sandy shore, how can we possibly use the old formula that says that the good will be rewarded and tough luck for the rest? Where then does this leave us? Like somebody said as I was coming in, am I going to feel better after this lecture is over? I don't know. If the innocent are as likely to suffer as the guilty, if the wicked are as likely to prosper as the virtuous, if the standard answers in response to suffering are worthless at best and often cause as much harm as the evil and injustice they seek to remedy, what are we to do? Let's return to the underlying purpose of the voice out of the whirlwind. The final poetic chapters in Job knock him out of the natural narcissism that accompanies loss and suffering. God's torrent of questions, the heaping piles of imagery, sweep Job out of himself like some rising river picking up driftwood on the cobbled shore. In self-transcendence, Job finds that his losses lose mass. His suffering ceases to drag him around in the way that some massive star drags planets through the galaxy. Even his own death ceases to matter very much. And once his own death does not matter very much, the result is he can be more deeply concerned about the suffering of others, not only because this concern is morally right, but because through his own suffering, he can establish an empathic connection to others. Let me try to make this same point in a way that is much more concrete. My father died a little over a year ago. He was an exceptionally kind and tender man, as well as a gifted engineer. Near the first anniversary of his death, I decided to go kayaking. Never mind that it was late November and ice was already forming around the edges of Placid Lake, and I had shelf ice in the river that flows into the lake. Since boats in one form or another had always been a part of his life, I figured this was a good way to honor his place in my life. I needed time by myself, time to remember, time to reflect on the things in him that abide in me. I'd been hoping for a clear autumn day, of course, but as I unloaded the boat, the visibility was about 200 yards. I paddled around the perimeter of the lake, proceeding by degrees, from indefinite tree to the hint of a roofline, the edge of a dock. Eventually, I passed under the outlet bridge and into the bay that in summer is choked with lily pads. The water level was too low, so I turned around. As I passed again under the wet timbers of the bridge and back into the lake, all boundaries dissolved. I could not tell where the lake ended and the sky began. I paddled and paddled into nothing but light. Did this experience remove the burden of grief? Of course not. But paddling into nothing but light, the concentration of grief diminished. And I saw that the boundaries between past and present, between external and internal, between one life and another, may soften. In such light, our lives are interfused. Or consider this example. If you can, try to project yourself into the life of a stranger. Your son has just been killed by a suicide bomber who triggered his belt in a Baghdad vegetable market. Your grief for your son and for your country lays over you like a suffocating blanket. You barely have the strength to raise your left hand to cover your gasping but speechless mouth. Days later, you work your way through checkpoints to the mosque. A faithful Muslim, you bathe before saying your prayers. As you settle into your ablutions, you notice light shining on the stone floor. The light is shaped like that of a star. A little skylight in the ceiling, cut in the form of a star, admits this symbol and lets it fall through the air to the ground. The mind that has been fastened to the memory of your son and the collective suffering of your country is suddenly struck by starlight on stone. Does this remove the suffering? No. But this image puts it in the context of a vast field of day-blind stars. Or consider this situation. Your sister lies dying in a hospital bed, the chemotherapy having accelerated her descent. No longer able to bear the sound of her labored breathing, and knowing that her heart will be the last thing to give out, you take a break and go for a drive. On the radio, you hear music. It might be a section from Bach's B minor Mass or the conclusion to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It could just as well be music by John or Alice Coltrane, Van Morrison, or even Leonard Cohen. But on this particular day, you hear Camille Saint-Saëns' Concerto for Violin and Piano. Broken open by everything you are about to lose, you give yourself to the music. As you attend to the dialogue between these two instruments, you begin to realize that you and your sister are part of a much larger conversation. The music does not remove the sharpness of impending loss, but it helps you return to the hospital and to acts of love that are what we can do while we are here. This then is why we ask Davidson Honors College students to read the book of Job. This book helps all of us see that suffering cannot be explained away, but it may be endured and in some cases transcended. The book demands that we see the inadequacy of most of our answers for suffering, and that when we pretend to explain it, we are probably trying desperately to comfort ourselves, not the ones who are hurting. For certain, the book challenges and rejects the old formula that the good will be rewarded and the thumb of God, but as a part of the spectacle of the world. Is this the time when I'm supposed to stand in the face of the whirlwind? Okay. Well, I hear that I'm supposed to field your questions. And for a little while, I'm willing to do that. But I may not know the answers. Yes?
Do you, in your class, deal with the theodicy question then that Job presents?
You know, let me answer that slightly indirectly. One of the things that I find,
Can you repeat the question?
sure. And that's what you were going to say, Herb, right? Do I deal with the question of theodicy, which is the correct term for all that I have just said? In class, one of the things that is so interesting is that many students have never even read the book of Job, and so they are facing this question for the first time, unless I can establish a connection with their own lived experience. And then they get it. Yes, okay, I have been wondering about this. And other students have read the book of Job, and they are so taken by the comforting solution of Job's restored fortunes at the end that they are not gripped by the throat by the great questions that we're looking at tonight. So, yes, we do look at the question, but please know that especially in a state institution, I don't try to be persuasive about whatever it is I believe about God. I want them to wrestle with the question, and they do in some cases. Linda?
I've tried to teach this in Liberal Studies 151, and it's difficult for students, I find, to get the idea of suffering.
Yes.
I mean, probably most of us will have a somewhat different idea at our age.
Yeah.
What it might be to suffer. For instance, when you talk about your child dying,
Mhm.
I can't imagine a worse thing. But
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have been able to imagine such an awful thing when I was 18 or 19.
Yeah.
So how is it that you can make this book important to students in a way that really engages them at the level at which they are? Not that they're silly or anything like that, but they're young. And
Yeah.
how does one do that?
Yeah. Linda is asking, given that most of the students are 18, 19, occasionally I get upperclassmen, or I've had upperclassmen in Ways of Knowing. How can any of us get the students to really grasp the gravity of this if they haven't suffered very much? I think I have not an answer, but several thoughts about that. One is I feel like I'm performing a service in having them read this book now, because when they turn 40 or 50 and maybe see this book again, they will encounter it in a very different way, but they will have a degree of familiarity that they wouldn't otherwise have, and I think that helps. I think all of my teaching, not just my teaching in Ways of Knowing, gives me an opportunity to tell students, and I do this repeatedly, to take their own experience, whatever it is, with utmost seriousness. I believe in their lives and what they encounter. And so they may not have a specific story that allows them to identify with Job, but if they take away some sense that my life and my story, my narrative counts, then eventually that connection will be made. And then at the same time, I want to say that there are a lot of stories that the students don't tell us. I happened to fill in for Phil West's amazing course on war and memory the other day. Excuse me, In another part of my life, I'm a woodworker, and I can go 12 hours and not say one word. So I'm not used to this. I was in this class with Phil, and one of the students just toward the end of the class, she's, it's like good therapy. She's watching the clock, and she's figuring out, okay, when can I say what I need to say? And in the last few moments, she says, well, Professor Hawk, I was in the North Tower when it was hit. So there are these stories. A student says, my dad died last year, or my sister was brain injured in a car accident. And I am always looking for that link between their lives and the text, whatever the text, not just Job. And so for me, this is one of the most exciting things about teaching, looking for those and helping them believe in their own stories. Hi, Jim. Great to see you again.
How can we reconcile the happy ending of the book of Job with the true message of the book itself, and suggest why that happy ending was included?
Oh gosh, Jim. Jim's question is, how can we reconcile the happy ending of the book with everything else that's in there? And what was the second half?
And why did the author
Oh, and why is it included? Well, let's see. This is the kind of thing that sometimes got me in trouble when I was a minister. But it may be that the prose sections were written by a different person. And we don't know who wrote the book of Job. We don't really know exactly when it was written. There's some clues so you can make some guesses. But it could be the case, I won't lose you because you're not my congregation, and I don't have a congregation anymore. It could be that somebody so discomforted by the guts of this book said, oh, wait a minute, before this enters the canon, we've got to do something. That may be one possibility. But I've also really read carefully Mitchell's commentary and one other about the daughters at the end and their names, and I can't quite bring that back from the deep recesses of my memory right now, but it really is as though Job gets swallowed up in beauty at the end, much as he gets swallowed up by the grand vision that comes to him in the whirlwind. So I think you could argue both ways, that it belongs and that it was attached later by a redactor who, just couldn't take all that intensity that you've just suffered through.
I remember reading a number of years ago when bad things happen
Yeah,
to people,
right.
which is, I think, perhaps a simplistic view of the Job story. But
Yeah.
in it, I remember that the rabbi says that suffering teaches us compassion, that's some of the value
Right.
of suffering. And you wonder if that idea is better than those nasty friends.
Yeah, I have several things to say about this. Sue is asking, what about that book by Rabbi Kushner, When Bad Things Happen to Good People? And is it possible that suffering has some value because it teaches us compassion? I once taught that book to my congregation in Helena, and I really wanted them to take very seriously his resistance to answers. Avoiding that old formula, the good will be rewarded, the bad will be punished. And boy, did I get my comeuppance. And I got it because inside many people there is such a desire to give an answer to suffering, even if we blame ourselves in the process, that they cannot stand the openness and the emptiness that goes with sitting in its presence silently. And so they were really upset about that book. And I learned how attached we are to our answers. Now, I might agree with you certainly that suffering awakens compassion, but that is not something I will ever say to anybody who is suffering. And I will be silent. And, you know, as I was thinking about having to stand here and do this, a story came to me. Some of you, even though he lived in Helena, might know the old great trumpeter Bruce Thompson. And one time, Bruce was in the hospital in Helena. Bruce played in all the big bands around Montana. He was originally from Miles City. And he had what the doctors thought might have been Rocky Mountain spotted fever. And Bruce was truly perched on the edge of life and death. And I entered his hospital room and tried to be very still and to sense what was happening. And I noticed pretty quickly that he was trembling, just shaking. And I went up to him and touched him and I said, "Bruce, are you cold?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Well, I'll be right back. I'm going to go get you a blanket." So I left the hospital room and found some nurses and told them the situation. We warmed up the blanket in a microwave, I think. And then I brought it to Bruce and I put it over him. And then I just let him absorb that heat. And I sat there in silence for, I don't know, 20 minutes, half hour. I didn't say a darn thing. And at the end, Bruce says to me, "Gary, thank you." And I knew that was the time to stand up and leave. So, I mean, I think there are things we can say to people, but I really want to stand for the power of presence and the power even of silent presence. That's an amazing thing. Yes?
What feedback do you get from the students that you talk to about this? What's their take on it?
Well, I think like the question is, what kind of feedback do I get from students about this? I would say that most of them are thinking, "Thank God we're done with Job." Yeah, that's right. That may be their contact with God, right there. I mean, and we rush. Ways of Knowing is such a hard course because we gallop. But, it depends on the student and it depends on the class. I mean, some student will say something to me about the patience of Job, and I want to just climb the walls, and I get right in that student's faith, and I say, "You show me his patience." There's no patience in this book. And, like I was saying to Linda, some students internalize this literature on some level, and someday they will identify with Job. So there's really a great range of response. And I want to say that that's true of all of the great texts that we put before them. And that's why we have this potpourri, this smorgasbord. Some are going to respond beautifully to Darwin, and I'm thinking of some of the coming lectures. Some are really going to identify with Socrates, and some are going to think, God, data is the thing. And some are going to be totally entranced by the modern poets. Or one of my students, a forestry kid from New Hampshire, was the only student in my class who really got the Tao Te Ching. And so it's just plumb exciting, but you never know who's going to respond to what. Linda?
Don't you think that one of the really exciting things about teaching undergraduates, whatever their age, I guess, about teaching, is that you never really know how students are going to respond or when.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the kind of thing about the kind of course you teach and the sorts of courses that I often teach.
Yeah.
Is that if they're the kind of courses that really ask students to think and inquire, we don't know how they're going to when it's going to come back to them, even if they never
Yeah.
ever again read Job.
Right.
Sometime down the pike, or if they don't read Greek tragedy or whatever. It's just something that might live with them and
Yeah.
work along, and so that at some time, it might really be important to them in a way that it's even maybe
Yeah.
not in the semester.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Linda's saying that we don't know how students will respond, and it may have value later. And I really find that to be the case, because students will sometimes come back to me. And I mean, the main course that I've been teaching is called Forgiveness and Reconciliation. And, you know, sometimes years and years later, students will send me an email saying what the course meant. And, you know, that's one of the great rewards. Hi, Glenn.
Gary, ought we, if we could, eliminate suffering?
Uh-huh.
And if not, why not?
Well, you're in a healing profession where you alleviate suffering to some extent, and not just within the individual, but in his or her relations with others, because the others are affected by this person's difficulty. Oh, you know, this is one of the questions I don't know the answer to, except in terms of my own life. And I would not trade what I have suffered in my life for what I have learned in my life. But that's for me to say, and that's for every one of us to say, not for somebody else to say for us. I'd actually like to know what you think about this, because I know the level on which you think.
Well, because it would be real cavalier to say that we always learn and grow from suffering and perspectives change and things of that sort. I'm just wondering if there were another avenue for learning those sorts of things, that one wouldn't have that. And maybe there are enlightened views that don't see the passing of a life as a bad thing and suffer from it.
Mm-hmm.
That the life was lived in grand and glorious ways, and it moved on. And,
Yeah.
and there is no suffering really in that. I have a loss and I feel bad, but maybe I shouldn't be suffering in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is not an answer. It's just one more thing that comes to me kind of on my feet. I see Jim Birchfield back there, and Jim recently gave me a copy of a short story by Hermann Hesse called The Indian Life. And it's really about the Hindu perspective on suffering and change and the various roles that we play throughout our lives. And one of the amazing things that I thought about as I was reading this piece was that sometimes we can, if not eliminate suffering, we can ease it slightly by holding it lightly. And I mean, it's hard for me not to talk about my own experience here. I want to be careful there, but it's as though we become transparent to our suffering, or we become permeable so that it flows through us rather than attaches to us. And I would say, and this is all I'll say now, that that's one of my goals for my own life, to let it move through me, to not attach to it like Velcro. Oh, way up there. Oh, hi, Yvonne.
Many years ago, when I was a freshman in college, I was involved in a dramatic production of J.B.
Oh, yes, by Archibald MacLeish.
And I just wondered, since you've studied the book of Job so much, how closely does that play reflect the book of Job? And also, do you recommend that to your students?
Oh, gosh. You're really putting me on the spot. I feel like one of Linda's students. I read J.B. when I was in college. I haven't read it since, and I can't answer your question. But I haven't recommended it. I no longer have my copy, but it's really something worth looking at. That'd be good to know. Yes.
I'm kind of curious about the narcissism that you identified coming out of suffering.
Right.
And there are plenty of jokes where two people are suffering and they have a competition about how it can be more about one
Yes.
themselves.
Right.
And yet the jokes never end where one of them says, "Oh, you're right." And it sounds like in the story of Job that God kind of says, "Wait, you think it's about you, but it's about me. I'm more narcissistic."
Oh.
Why does that pull Job out of his suffering, whereas it never works when he's Job?
Yeah, right. I'm more narcissistic than you are. Yeah. I hope you could hear the question. She was asking me about the theme of narcissism, and could it be that that God is more narcissistic than Job, and why on earth does that help Job? The thing that really occurred to me as I was working on tonight's lecture was how the pronouns shift. And there isn't a whole lot of I, me, my from God in the section on the whirlwind. It's, as I said, more second-person pronoun. And my reading, not everybody is going to see it the same way, is that God is doing, another thing that'll get me in trouble, God is doing the best she can to break things open, to open Job's eyes, to have him cast his glance higher. And I think we could all reread that section and see, well, is God really narcissistic here, or is it more like what I'm saying, where God's just doing anything possible to shake Job out of the old position that he's in? But it's a great question. The way Ron Perrin was laughing made me think he thinks God's pretty narcissistic at the end. Oh, yeah. Hi.
Could you go back to this gentleman's question about the elimination of suffering and whether that would be a good thing? Because as he asked it reminded me that much of what you talked about was how suffering helps us transcend something. And indeed how we see suffering. Certainly those that in marathon sports,
Sure.
exploration, or I think of the tour bicyclists say you must suffer.
No pain, no gain. Okay, this gentleman is calling me back to Glenn's question about suffering and its value and whether or not we should try to eliminate it. And again, I think I'll go back to my own experience this time as a father and say that one of the joys of my life as the father to sons who are 32 and 29 is to now talk with them about what they have suffered in their lives already. Did I, as a father, try to prevent suffering? Did I try to eliminate suffering? Did I try to protect them from suffering? Did I try to comfort them at the time when they suffered? You bet. I think we have that responsibility. And yet, we are up against the limits of our power. Anybody who's had a kid knows that your kid is going to experience things that you cannot save them from. And I've been there in spades. But now, to be able to talk with my sons about the ways in which they have integrated their life experience is one of the true joys of my life. And on that field, we enter as equals. And that's a good thing. We're no longer father and kid. And can we do that with other people? I think we have a duty to try to protect and prevent, comfort when we can, but then also be there as people begin to integrate, revise the narrative trajectory of their lives, make sense of it, make new meaning, come to a new sense of purpose. Yeah, that's a great thing. Well, let's see. Jean, I saw yours first, and then the gentleman in front of you.
excuse me, I also think as parents, however, we have a responsibility to try to get our kids to get beyond their suffering. I don't think we should allow them to use whatever suffering they've had to deal with as a crutch. Well, if this hadn't happened, you know, things would be so much better in my life.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you agree or not.
Do you have a background in the law, Gene? No, I know. I'm just feeling a little cornered. Gene's question is, do we have a responsibility to help our kids get beyond using what they have suffered as a crutch or as an excuse? And it's interesting because, you know, I met briefly with my forgiveness class just before coming here, and we were talking about the way people can become attached to their role as victim. That's a very serious thing. I have a strong feeling that there are limits to our power, but as my sons know, I was not very patient when they were using their suffering as an excuse to go on being victims or to fail in their responsibilities. Yeah, I just wasn't very patient about that. And yet I have also watched them grow in their capacity to assume responsibility for their lives, partly because I didn't rescue them, I didn't pick up all the pieces, I didn't have enough money to pay their way out of the trouble they got into at times, and that was a good thing.
Would you reflect for a few moments on the difference from the sufferer who is the survivor versus the sufferer who isn't? You know, it's one thing to reflect upon, endure grief.
Yes.
But what of someone that is in such physical suffering, and you know, in the last moment?
Yes. Oh yeah. This person is asking me about a very crucial distinction, namely that between someone who suffers and then later has time to make whatever sense he or she can of that experience, and someone who, to use the old phrase, suffers unto death. Well, of course, in my personal life and in my pastoral life, I have seen both aplenty. And I mean, this might seem just too simple. It's the only sense of this I have. The duty that I came to feel that I had in the face of suffering unto death was to not run from it, but to stay with that person or that situation absolutely as long and far as I could. And I mean, the language that not just I, but others use is accompany. At least I could accompany this person until their last breath, or as far as I could, or to the limits of my strength. And that's part of what I meant when I used that phrase with regard to the third story I told about the woman whose sister is dying, when I said acts of love. I think the ultimate act of love is accompaniment. And I held myself to a very high standard there. I don't serve in that capacity now, but when my students are struggling with something, either intellectually or in their own lives, again, you know, and thank God it's not suffering unto death. Again, I'm just trying to accompany them. And I mean, that is way beyond my job description, but golly, I think it's important.
I'm intrigued by your literary analysis with pronouns. So
Yeah.
I want to make certain I understand you correctly. That God, in making Job suffer, increases his narcissism. correct?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm willing to say that God makes Job suffer.
Or he lets him suffer, I should say.
Okay.
Job's suffering, Job's narcissism is increased throughout that whole first passage.
Right.
And then the revelatory moment is when the narcissism is exploded.
Yes, that's a
So
good way to
when
put it.
When the God figure begins to speak to him, as you point out, and uses the second person pronoun,
Yeah.
he's further amplifying that narcissism till the point that it explodes of its own accord.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to look at it. So I'm not hearing a question, but
Well, I'm asking you if
Yeah.
that makes sense with the threads that you,
yeah,
he's not scolding him out of his mouth.
right, right. He just so overwhelms Job with this portrait of the universe that Job says, oh, God, what does it matter if I live or die? I'm a part of this somehow, conscious or not, this unbelievable pageant.
But he's using the pronoun you
Yeah.
is interpreted by Job as I.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
He's just making it,
Yeah, it's like he's turning up the heat under the boiler.
damn right. That's it.
Yeah, right.
You want to be narcissistic? I'll show you.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's how Ron sees it. Dan, you're going to help me out here, right?
I wanted to add one other piece that I think even makes that point even further. If you do a careful textual analysis of Job's curse in chapter 3,
Uh-huh.
one of the interpretations of what Job is demanding of God is that God reverse the day of creation
Yes.
because Job's suffering.
Yes.
So because Job is suffering, he wants light to become darkness,
Yeah.
he wants night or day to become night. He literally takes the very first days of creation and says, reverse all that.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
what's so fascinating about the voice out of the whirlwind is God then goes back and narrates the whole tale of creation.
Yeah.
Instead of the way it ends in Genesis 1 with the culmination of being human beings are absent from the way it's narrated. They're simply missing in those chapters there.
Uh-huh.
All the elements there.
Uh.
And so you can read it as a really radical decentering of
Yeah.
human preoccupation with self, or narcissism in that sense.
Yeah.
And that, again, seems to be, and so God never directly answers Job's questions.
Yeah.
But in the way that it tells that speech, it directly responds to the original curse. And
Uh-huh.
Job is, I think, overwhelmed by it. Hasn't it? And then when he says, I spoke, but I didn't understand.
Yeah.
You can really see it going back to that original curse, saying, now that I'm suffering, why don't you just reverse all of creation?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in case not everyone could hear what Dan is saying, he makes this beautiful comparison between Job's cursing at the beginning of the book, in which Job wants God to undo creation, like roll this thing back, buddy, and the very end where God sort of unfolds it in its grand splendor, but without reference to human beings. And I mean, that's a beautiful literary device to uncreate, recreate. So thanks a lot for that analysis of the text. Yes?
Without the addition of the ending with everything returned to him, his children,
Yeah.
do you think it would have been a very joyful experience at the point where Job realizes that there is a God, and that God really wanted to communicate with him and let him know that as he described the universe and its majesty,
Yeah.
he was also suggesting, I'm that much more.
Oh, yes. Well, I think one could certainly read it that way. And when you, the question is, if we excise the prose portion at the end and just let it end with Job's mystical experience in the whirlwind, would that be an ample experience of joy? And, here's where we really run into the problems of translation, those last lines that Job speaks. And not knowing the Hebrew, that's really beyond me, but I have a collection of some of the different ways in which the ending can be translated. And, I think if you look at the whole spectrum of those passages, there's probably everything from joy to resignation, a sense of defeat, to sort of, oh darn, I lost. I mean, there's this whole range of possible ways of reading that depending on how it's translated. And I don't know all of the complexities around the Hebrew.
But he certainly seems to understand more.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Whether he's joyous about it or not,
Yeah.
I get the sense that he sees how he fits in somehow.
Right. Yeah, and fitting in, I mean, that's a very important phrase, I think, because, when we're in that narcissistic state, we're not fitting into anything but ourselves. When we transcend that state, we're suddenly fitting in to the rest of life. And that is a pretty grand thing, I think. Hi, Maura.
When I heard you were going to be discussing the book of Job, I have a copy of Eugene Peterson's book, The Message.
Oh, okay.
And so I read his, quote, take on Job. And I was really more interested in the 3 or 4 gentlemen that question Job all the time.
Yeah.
And their innocuous question, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have used that word. Their questions of Job. And I thought, that's me.
Ah, yes.
So how do we, as a society, learn what you've done to live and do lightly, rather than being so wonderful with our intuition and helpful suggestions?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. By the way, Maura, I haven't read Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of Job, but Maura is asking, or she's saying that as she read it, she kind of identified with Job's friends and found herself or remembered herself saying the kinds of things that they say to Job. And I absolutely agree, and that's one of the things I said in my lecture, that sometimes we are in that role, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the great things that Mitchell helps us see is how when we are there, we're often trying to comfort ourselves or quell our own terror and not just, comfort Job. And then Maura asked me, I know this is beyond a personal question, how we learn to do that, to do our suffering and hold it lightly. I mean, I didn't come to the university by the typical route. I did other things before I came here. And one of the great things about that is that a congregation teaches a minister, if he or she is open to the teaching, how to be a minister. And in that process, and you can put this in any context that works for you, doesn't have to be the church, you could say a community teaches us how to be. Well, if you give out the answers that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar give, and you're paying attention, you find that they don't work very well, that they build resentment, or people turn away, or they aren't satisfying. And learning that was a crucial piece of growth for me in ministry. Fortunately, I learned it very early. But our communities, our friends, sometimes our families can teach us what works and what doesn't. But I really feel very strongly that we have a responsibility to learn that. And I don't see personal or collective suffering diminishing in the near future. And our capacity to respond to it skillfully, I think, is a responsibility that rests on all of our shoulders.
Maybe
one more?
Oh, for Jim, absolutely.
For Jim, absolutely.
Gary, I just want to say that I'm extremely grateful that you are here in our midst. Thank you for a tremendous presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Is this on? It is
It
on.
is. Mhm.
Thanks a million. You're a wonderful class. Every faculty member's best dream. And I think you can see exactly the quality of the people and the quality of the material and the quality of the kind of confrontation that your students get and the commitment that they get from this kind of faculty person. So thank you very, very much, Gary. I think we should be silent for a little while in the face of this. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and I hope you come back next week.